It started with a simple drive home, until the flashing lights changed everything. Marcus Reynolds had just finished a long day at work, the kind that left his shoulders heavy with exhaustion, but his mind still buzzing with unfinished thoughts. His car, a sleek black sedan, moved smoothly through the quiet suburban streets, the soft hum of the engine blending with the faint jazz playing through the speakers. The sun was sinking low, casting an amber glow over the neighborhood, the last breath of daylight stretching across the pavement like liquid gold. He wasn't in a rush. There was no urgency in his drive, no reckless speed, no sudden stops. Just a man on his way home, thinking about dinner, about the emails he still had to answer, about whether he had the energy to go to the gym or if the couch would win tonight's battle. Then came the lights, red and blue, flashing violently in his rearview mirror. The kind of sight that makes your heart skip, even when you've done nothing wrong. For a moment, Marcus just stared at them, his mind catching up to what was happening. He glanced at the speedometer, normal, looked around at the empty intersection, nothing suspicious. His hands were at 10 and 2, his seatbelt fastened. There was no logical reason for this stop, but logic didn't matter in moments like these. With a slow breath, he flipped on his turn signal, because that's what you do even when you're already being pulled over, then guided his car toward the curb, bringing it to a smooth, controlled stop. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel for a brief second before he let them go. He had been here before, not this exact street, not this exact moment, but the situation. It was all too familiar. He glanced at his phone, lying in the center console. Should he start recording? Should he call someone? Number. He knew how to handle this. He always did. A moment passed, then another. The patrol car behind him remained still, the lights still flashing, the engine idling like a predator waiting to strike. And then the door opened. The officer emerged. Marcus watched in his side mirror as a man in uniform approached, his gait slow, deliberate, like he was preparing for a confrontation that hadn't even begun. The officer's face was set in a hard expression, his hand resting near his belt, not quite on his weapon, but close enough that the message was clear. Marcus inhaled deeply through his nose, exhaled just as slowly. Then, keeping his movements deliberate, he lowered his window. "License and registration," the officer said immediately. No greeting, no explanation, just an order. Marcus looked at him fully now. The name tag read, Carter, Officer Daniel Carter. Square jaw, buzz cut, mid-40s, the kind of man who carried himself like he had something to prove. His eyes, a cold blue, studied Marcus with something unreadable, something that made it clear this wasn't just about a traffic stop. "Of course," Marcus said smoothly, his voice even. He moved carefully, making sure both hands were visible, reaching slowly toward his glove compartment. He knew the routine. No sudden movements, no questions yet. The officer watched his hands the entire time. As Marcus handed over his documents, Carter took them without a word, his eyes flicking back and forth between the license and the man sitting in front of him. "You know why I pulled you over?" Marcus shook his head slightly. "No, officer, I don't." Carter clicked his tongue, tapping the license against his palm. "Rolled through that stop sign back there." Marcus frowned. "Which stop sign?" Carter's jaw tightened just slightly. "Don't play dumb." Marcus held his gaze for a moment. He had been on this road every day for the past 6 months. He knew it well. There was no stop sign at the last intersection, but arguing would only make things worse. "I see," Marcus said finally. "I apologize if I missed it." Carter didn't respond. He was still staring at Marcus, his eyes moving over his face like he was trying to solve a puzzle, like there was something about Marcus that didn't sit right with him. And then the shift. His posture changed. His grip on the license tightened just slightly. His shoulders squared. "You're not from around here, are you?" Marcus blinked. The question was casual on the surface, but the way Carter said it made it clear. This wasn't small talk. It wasn't curiosity. It was something else. "My address is on my license," Marcus said, his voice even. Carter's eyes flicked to the ID, but it was clear he wasn't really looking at it. That so? A long, tense silence stretched between them. Marcus knew what was happening. He could feel it. The officer was searching for something, anything, to justify dragging this out. The stop sign excuse had been weak at best. Now he was fishing. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" Carter asked, tilting his head slightly. Marcus didn't flinch. "Just going home." Carter smirked, but it wasn't friendly, more like he had decided something in his mind, some unspoken conclusion about Marcus that had nothing to do with a stop sign and everything to do with the color of his skin. "That right?" Carter mused. "Because I've been patrolling this area a long time. Don't think I've seen you around." Marcus exhaled quietly. He didn't answer right away, letting the silence do the work. Carter was expecting something. Nervousness, defensiveness, maybe even fear. He didn't get any of it, and that seemed to bother him. His eyes narrowed. Then, with no warning, he handed the license back. Not the registration, just the license. "Step out of the car," he said. Marcus remained still, his fingers curled slightly around the steering wheel. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" Carter's smirk widened just slightly, like he had been waiting for Marcus to push back, like he wanted it. "I don't have to give you a reason," Carter said. "I asked you to step out. Don't make this harder than it has to be." The threat was subtle, unspoken, but unmistakable. Marcus stared at him for a long moment. Then, finally, he reached for the door handle. If this was the game Carter wanted to play, Marcus was ready, because what Carter didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that the man he was trying to intimidate was his boss. And tonight, Officer Carter was about to learn a lesson he'd never forget. Marcus stepped out of the car, his polished shoes pressing against the pavement with a quiet finality. The air outside was warm but carried a slight chill as the sun dipped lower behind the buildings. A strange silence settled between him and Officer Carter, the kind that wasn't just about sound, but tension, thick and charged. Carter took a step back, scanning Marcus up and down. His eyes lingered on the tailored suit, the pristine shine of the shoes, the way Marcus carried himself. There was something about him that didn't fit the usual mold of people Carter liked to stop. But that didn't seem to stop him from treating Marcus like a suspect anyway. "Step toward the front of the vehicle," Carter instructed. His voice had changed, less routine, more aggressive, like he needed to establish control of the situation before it slipped away from him. Marcus complied, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He had dealt with men like Carter before. He knew exactly how this game was played. "Hands where I can see them," Carter added as Marcus reached the hood of the car. Marcus spread his fingers, holding them up slightly before resting them against the warm metal of his sedan. The way Carter's eyes flicked toward Marcus's hands, as if expecting sudden movement, wasn't lost on him. "Do you mind telling me what this is about?" Marcus asked, his voice calm. Carter let out a short breath, his lips twitching. "Just a routine check." Routine. Marcus had heard that word before. It was the kind of word officers used when they wanted to justify something they had no business doing. "What exactly are you checking for?" Marcus asked, his tone still measured. Carter's smirk widened. "That's not how this works. I asked the questions." The words carried weight, a challenge, a warning. Marcus didn't take the bait. He remained still, his posture steady, his breathing even, but inside, his mind was working, calculating. This wasn't just about the stop anymore. It never was. Carter took a step closer, standing just behind Marcus now. "You seem real comfortable," he muttered. Marcus didn't move. "Should I be uncomfortable?" Carter exhaled sharply through his nose. "Most people get a little nervous when they're in this position." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Why would I be nervous?" Carter didn't answer. Instead, he reached forward, his hands roughly patting down Marcus's pockets. The search wasn't quick, wasn't professional. It was designed to provoke, to remind Marcus of who had the power in this moment. Marcus let it happen, not because he wanted to, but because he knew Carter wanted a reaction. If he gave him one, it would only escalate. Carter's hands moved over Marcus's jacket, then down his sides, patting his pockets again, as if expecting something to appear out of thin air. "You carrying anything I should know about?" Carter asked, his voice almost casual. "You tell me," Marcus replied. Carter's hands stilled for just a fraction of a second before he stepped back. His face was unreadable, but his body language said enough. He was annoyed, frustrated that Marcus hadn't reacted the way he expected. "You're clean," Carter muttered, as if it was some kind of disappointment. Marcus turned slowly, meeting Carter's gaze head-on. "Of course, I am." The silence between them stretched, the tension rising with each second that passed. Carter's eyes flicked to the car, then back to Marcus. He wasn't done yet. He wanted more. He needed more. "You seem real familiar with how this works," Carter said, his voice dropping just slightly. "You a lawyer or something?" Marcus's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Something like that." Carter's expression darkened. He didn't like the ambiguity. He didn't like that Marcus wasn't afraid. "What's that supposed to mean?" Marcus shrugged slightly. "It means I understand my rights." Carter's fingers twitched near his belt. It was subtle, but Marcus saw it. He saw the way Carter's jaw clenched, the way his body tensed. "You think you're smarter than me?" Carter asked, his voice just a little too sharp. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "I didn't say that." "But you're thinking it." Marcus exhaled. "No, officer. I'm just thinking that this interaction has gone far beyond a simple traffic stop." Carter took another step closer, his face just inches from Marcus's now. "And what exactly do you think this is?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the silence linger, let Carter feel the weight of it. "I think it's about something that has nothing to do with the law," Marcus said finally. Carter's eyes flickered, just for a second, like he had been caught in something he wasn't ready to admit. "You don't know what you're talking about," he muttered. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Don't I?" The challenge was there, hidden beneath his words. A challenge that made Carter's hand tighten into a fist for just a moment before he exhaled sharply and took a step back. "Turn around," Carter said abruptly, hands on the hood again. Marcus didn't move. Carter's nostrils flared. "You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." Marcus studied him. He could see the desperation creeping in now, the need to regain control, to assert his authority. But Marcus had already seen what he needed to see. Carter wasn't in control. Not anymore. Still, he turned, placed his hands on the hood once more, let Carter think he was still calling the shots. Carter stepped in again, pressing against Marcus's back just slightly, just enough to remind him that he was the one with the badge. "You got an attitude," Carter muttered as he ran his hands over Marcus's pockets again. "That's gonna get you in trouble one day." Marcus smiled to himself. Not today. Carter finished his search, stepping back again, but the smugness had started to fade from his face. "You're not gonna find what you're looking for, Officer Carter," Marcus said smoothly as he turned back around. Carter exhaled loudly. "You don't know what I'm looking for." Marcus met his gaze, his expression calm. "I think we both do." For the first time, Carter looked uncertain. His confidence had cracks in it now, small but visible. He had expected fear. He had expected submission. Instead, he had found something else entirely, and it was starting to rattle him. But the real moment of reckoning was still ahead, because Carter had no idea who he was actually dealing with. Not yet. Carter's smirk was gone now. His posture was still rigid, his chest slightly puffed out like he was trying to maintain the upper hand, but something had shifted. There was hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of doubt. The way Marcus had held himself, the way he hadn't folded under pressure, it wasn't what Carter was used to. Most people would have stumbled over their words by now, tried to explain themselves, maybe even pleaded. But Marcus hadn't done any of that. He had remained calm, controlled, and that unsettled Carter more than he was willing to admit. "You think you're real smart, don't you?" Carter muttered. Marcus gave a small, patient smile. "I think I know my rights." Carter's jaw twitched. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but instead he exhaled sharply through his nose and shook his head. His hand, the one that had been hovering near his belt, finally moved away, resting on his hip instead. "You people always like to talk about rights," he said under his breath. Marcus caught it, every single word. "You people." It wasn't loud, but it didn't have to be. It hung in the air like smoke, thick and impossible to ignore. For the first time, Marcus felt his pulse quicken, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, a slow, simmering anger, not just at Carter, not just at this moment, but at how predictable it all was. Carter must have realized his mistake because he straightened up quickly, like he was trying to backtrack without actually taking anything back. "I didn't mean—" he started. Marcus held up a hand. "No need to explain, Officer Carter. I understood you perfectly." Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. He was slipping, and he knew it. The confidence he had at the start of this stop had been chipped away piece by piece, and now, for the first time, he was looking at Marcus differently. Not as a suspect, not as someone beneath him, but as a problem. Because Carter had learned to handle fear. He had built his entire career off of intimidation. But this was something else entirely. This was a man standing in front of him who wasn't afraid. And that made Carter uneasy. Marcus slowly reached for his wallet. He moved deliberately, carefully, just in case Carter's instincts were worse than his judgment. He flipped it open, letting the small, gleaming badge inside catch the dim light. Carter's eyes flicked to it, and then they widened. It took a second for him to register what he was seeing. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. His face, which had been locked in an expression of authority for the entire interaction, suddenly shifted into something else. Confusion, shock, realization. Marcus gave him a moment. Let him process it. Let him feel that slow, creeping horror sink in. Finally, he spoke. "Marcus Reynolds," he said, voice even, "head of internal affairs." Carter took a step back. His entire posture changed, like he had just touched something burning hot and didn't know what to do next. Internal affairs. Those two words carried a weight that not even a badge could counter. Carter's eyes darted back and forth between the badge and Marcus's face, like he was hoping, somehow, that he had misread it, that this was all some kind of joke. But Marcus wasn't laughing. Carter swallowed hard. You're with IA." Marcus closed his wallet and tucked it back into his pocket. "I am." Carter's hands twitched at his sides. "Why didn't you say anything?" Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Would it have made a difference?" Carter blinked, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to find an answer. But what could he say? If he admitted that yes, it would have made a difference, then he was acknowledging that his behavior was wrong, that it was based not on policy or law, but on assumption. If he said no, then he had to confront the fact that he had just harassed the man who had the power to determine whether he stayed in uniform at all. There was no good answer, so he said nothing. Marcus exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "That's what I thought." The silence stretched between them. Carter, still trying to salvage what little control he had left, straightened up. "Look, I was just—" "Just what?" Marcus interrupted. Carter hesitated. Marcus took a step forward, closing the gap between them. "You pulled me over for a stop sign that doesn't exist. You ordered me out of the car without probable cause. You patted me down for weapons when there was no reason to believe I had any. And then, when I didn't respond the way you expected, you escalated. You went looking for a problem." Carter's throat bobbed as he swallowed again. "That's not—" Marcus cut him off again, his voice sharper now. "You know what the most dangerous kind of cop is, Officer Carter." Carter didn't answer. Marcus didn't need him to. It's not the one who breaks the law. It's not even the one who abuses power, Marcus continued. It's the one who doesn't even realize what he's doing is wrong. Carter shifted uncomfortably. Marcus's voice dropped, steady but firm. Do you realize it now? Carter didn't answer right away. He seemed to be warring with himself, trying to decide if he wanted to keep up the bravado or finally acknowledge what had just happened. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. I was just doing my job. Marcus's eyes narrowed. No, you weren't. Carter's gaze flicked away. He wasn't smirking anymore. His hands were no longer near his belt, no longer squared on his hips like he was ready for a fight. Because there was no fight to be had anymore, he had lost. Marcus exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Here's what's going to happen, Officer Carter. Carter stiffened again. You're going to take a step back. You're going to return my registration. And then you're going to think very carefully about what happens next. Carter's lips parted slightly, but he said nothing. His fingers twitched like he wanted to resist, but after a few seconds, he moved. Slowly, reluctantly, he reached into his pocket, pulled out Marcus's registration, and handed it over. Marcus took it, his movements just as controlled as they had been from the beginning. He tucked it away, then looked back at Carter one last time. You're going to hear from me again. Carter's face paled slightly. But not as the man you pulled over on the side of the road, Marcus added, as the man who decides whether you're fit to wear that badge. Carter's breath hitched. Marcus didn't linger. He turned, walked back to his car, and slid into the driver's seat. His hands gripped the wheel, but he didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he sat for a moment, letting the weight of what had just happened settle in. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him, but it would be the last time it happened to Officer Carter, and the first step toward making sure it didn't happen to anyone else. Marcus sat in his car for a moment, watching Carter through the rearview mirror. The officer hadn't moved yet. He just stood there, stiff and still, staring at the ground as if the weight of what had just happened was finally starting to settle on his shoulders. Marcus could feel it. This wasn't just about their encounter anymore. This was about everything that came next. Carter wasn't thinking about a stop sign. He wasn't thinking about a routine traffic stop. He was thinking about his future, about his career, about the file that would soon have his name in it, under a department he had no control over. Marcus inhaled slowly, then exhaled, pressing his foot against the accelerator. His car rolled forward smoothly, leaving Carter standing in the fading light, still frozen in place. As Marcus pulled onto the main road, the tension in his chest didn't fade. He had handled the moment exactly as he needed to. He hadn't lashed out. He hadn't let Carter goad him into reacting. He had remained in control, made Carter feel the shift in power without ever raising his voice. But it wasn't enough, because this wasn't about Carter, not really. It was about the fact that men like Carter existed in every department, in every city, in every precinct, that this interaction could have gone another way. And for too many people, it had. He wasn't going to let this slide, not this time. By the time Marcus pulled into his driveway, his mind was already running through his next steps. The following morning, Marcus walked into the Internal Affairs office, his expression unreadable, but his mind sharp with purpose. He sat at his desk, flipping through reports, but his focus wasn't on the paperwork. It was on the name that now sat at the top of his mental list. Officer Daniel Carter. Marcus clicked his pen against the desk, then reached for his phone. The call didn't take long. It didn't need to. By the afternoon, Officer Carter's name had been flagged for review, and it wasn't just him. Marcus wasn't interested in taking down a single officer. That wasn't how change happened. One bad cop losing his badge didn't fix a system designed to protect them. No, Marcus wanted something bigger. He spent the next several days combing through department records, pulling complaints, looking for patterns. He requested reports, examined stop and search data, read through case after case of officers whose behavior had been excused with a slap on the wrist. It didn't take long to see the truth. Carter wasn't an exception. He was the rule. A week later, Marcus sat across from Chief Daniels, a man who had spent decades wearing the badge, who had seen every type of officer walk through the doors of the department, good, bad, and everything in between. His office was lined with plaques, commendations, framed photographs of him shaking hands with city officials. But Marcus wasn't here to talk about achievements. Daniels leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in front of him. "You've been busy." Marcus nodded. "I have." Daniels exhaled through his nose. "I read the report. Officer Carter is under review, but I'm guessing you didn't come here just to talk about one officer." "No," Marcus said simply. Daniels tapped a finger against his desk. "You want a full review of the department?" "I do." Daniels sighed, rubbing his temples. "You know what that means, right? This department already has enough eyes on it. You start digging through complaints, policies, stop and frisk numbers. People are going to push back, a lot of them." Marcus leaned forward. "Good." Daniels gave him a hard look. "You think this is just about one case, one officer?" Marcus shook his head. I think it's about a culture that allows officers like Carter to believe they can get away with it. I think it's about a system that protects bad cops more than it protects the people they're supposed to serve." Daniels studied him for a long moment. Then he exhaled. "You're going to make a lot of people uncomfortable." Marcus didn't flinch. Then maybe they should ask themselves why this makes them uncomfortable. A silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Daniels nodded. "All right." Just like that, the review was set in motion. The weeks that followed were filled with meetings, audits, interviews. Marcus sat across from officers who had spent their entire careers believing they would never have to answer for their actions. He listened to community members who had long since lost faith in the system. He compiled evidence, built cases, laid out patterns that had been ignored for years. Carter's name wasn't the only one under review anymore. It wasn't fast, it wasn't easy, and it sure as hell wasn't simple, but it was happening. Months later, Marcus stood at the podium of a community town hall, addressing a room filled with officers, city officials, and citizens who had been waiting for change for too long. He didn't talk about Carter. He didn't need to. Instead, he spoke about responsibility, about what it meant to wear a badge, about the weight that came with the power officers were given, and the accountability that had to come with it. "Justice isn't just about catching criminals," Marcus said, his voice steady. "It's about making sure those sworn to uphold the law do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for everyone they encounter." He let his words settle over the crowd. "That badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." There was silence for a long moment. Then, slowly, applause rippled through the room. Some clapped because they believed in his words. Some clapped because they knew they had no choice. And some didn't clap at all, because real change didn't happen in a single moment. It started here, but it wouldn't end here. Marcus knew that, and he was ready for what came next.